Welcome to the Small Church Podcast, the podcast for church leaders who want to make a difference in their communities. We're your hosts, Tony Marr and Bruce Montgomery, and we're excited to be with you today. On this podcast, we'll be discussing the latest trends, strategies, and ideas for effective leadership in small-sized churches. So whether you're a pastor, a ministry leader, or a volunteer, this podcast is for you. Each week, we'll bring you interviews with experienced church leaders who have valuable insights to share. We'll also explore topics like team building, community outreach, spiritual growth, and much more. So if you're looking for practical advice and inspiration to help you lead your church with excellence, you've come to the right place. The Small Church Podcast is brought to you by Higher Ministries. Higher Ministries is an organization that exists to help Christian leaders in the churches they serve through coaching and consulting, all for little or no cost. For more information on Higher Ministries or to find out more about the Small Church Podcast, please visit higherministries.com. Thanks for tuning into this week's edition of the Small Church Podcast. Well, hello and welcome to the Small Church Podcast. I am Tony Marr with my good friend and co-host Bruce Montgomery, and we are honored that you have taken some time, either on your drive or in your office, or maybe you're running on the treadmill right now, but we're honored that you've taken some time to listen to us here. Bruce, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. I'm very happy to be here with you and start this new part of our lives.
Yeah, me too. So we wanted to take some time today. This is our first episode of this podcast. It's going to be a weekly podcast that you'll be able to find anywhere that you like to find and listen to podcasts. And today we wanted to take some time just to introduce ourselves, introduce who we are, where we come from, and what this podcast is all about. There are literally tens of thousands of podcasts out there. Several hundred podcasts that have to deal with church leadership and leadership in general. So why another podcast? Why did we feel the need and the desire to start something new, to add to our schedules, and flood your headspace with more words? What is different about what we're doing? What gives us the right, the credentials, I could say, to even stand beside these mics and talk to you about church leadership, specifically small church leadership? And so, Bruce, I have known you for probably about 25 years now, maybe even a little longer than that. And you are one of the most experienced, gifted leaders and communicators that I have ever had the privilege of knowing. Why don't you take just a minute and give our listeners a little bit of a background on who you are, where you come from, and what's brought you to this point?
Okay. I grew up going to church, but it was just going to church like I grew up going to school. It didn't mean anything to me, and I really didn't think the church was very powerful. I thought it was an anachronism. It was just out of date, out of place, and it was weak. And when I met a new youth minister at the church that I still had to go to, my parents thought that was required. When I went him and he cared about me, I learned some things, and I found that the church is not an anachronism. I found it's not a weak organization. It's actually the most powerful organization in the world, and that's the way God designed it, the way He did. It's not just an organization; it's an organism. It's a living creation of God, and
At least it should be, unless the church is dead.
yeah, unless it's dead. But what it gave me for was a passion for the church. And all the way through my ministry, training for ministry, through seminary, the church was what I really, really was focusing on. I even have a PhD in organizational communication because I wanted to help the church and use organizational skills to kind of get that done. And I've enjoyed the ride. 54 years in ministry. Many years I was doing teaching at Milligan University also, but at the same time I was still working in the church. Church is a center part of my life. And I love the church, and I love helping the church, and I want to see people grow in the church, and I want to see us make that the same kind of community I experience for other people, so that the church is a good experience, and it's a growing experience. It leads to many relationships that are important in our lives, and it's not the size. It's the passion that we have for it. So I guess that's a beginning point. I've done ministry in large churches. I've done ministry as a campus minister. For 15 years, I was at Bowling Green State University, and I treated my ministry there as we were putting together a hybrid church, and we treated our campus ministry as just that. The students were the congregation, and we had elders observing us from churches outside, and we just learned how church worked. And we learned how it worked because it was a set of relationships. You can be in a church of 3,000, or you can be in a church of 30. But the big thing is, a church of 3,000 is just a bunch of small churches meeting in the same place. And you can't know all those people. In a small church, I don't want them to see or look at a small church as being lacking in resources or lacking in things. It has all that it needs. And I want people to be able to see that and to rejoice in it and to grow in it. And so Tony and I'd like to help people see that, help leaders see the role they can play, help leaders see vision, and that it's not they don't have to go around without vision. We want them to have vision so that they can grow. That's kind of where I am, Tony.
Bruce, when I was I was born and raised in a small little town out west called Las Vegas, Nevada. And my family got to Las Vegas because my dad was a youth minister at a church out there. And over the course of my childhood and adolescence, we saw this church that I was a part of grow from about 150 people to about 2,500 people. When I was in high school, the church had the vision to plant a church on the other side of the Las Vegas Valley. And so I was uprooted from the only church that I had ever known, the only home that I had ever known, and dropped in a school on the other side of town with people that I didn't know to start a new church. Our first week of that church, we had 1,000 people that showed up in a high school cafeteria. We then saw rapid growth over the course of my last couple of years of high school. And then I made the decision that I was going to move 2,000 miles across the country to East Tennessee, a place that I had never been, to begin studying to go into ministry. And what I found when I came to East Tennessee in the mid-90s was there were no churches that looked like the churches that I grew up in. There were no churches that looked like anything that I was familiar with. My first couple of weeks, they would have vans that would come and pick up those of us freshmen and other students that didn't have cars and would take us to different churches. We would go to whichever church was having a potluck that Sunday so that we could get fed. And we would sit in these uncomfortable things that they called pews. They would ask us to reach out and grab this hardbound maroon book and turn to page 136, and we were going to sing verses 1, 3, 5, and 7. And I'd never experienced this before. I looked around, and instead of there being hundreds, if not thousands of people, I could count everybody that was in the service with me on maybe my 2 hands and 2 feet. It was something that I'd never experienced before, the small church. And yet what I found in that small church was an authenticity that was something that I maybe hadn't experienced before. Also around that time, I met a professor of mine that had a huge impact on my life immediately. And over the course of the last 25, 30 years, that influence that you've had in my life has been immeasurable. And as I shifted through all the different waves of life and waves of ministry, you, through a quarter of a century, have been kind of that solid voice of reason and voice of guidance through so many different trials, so many different tribulations. And when I left school, graduated, and went back out west to start a church, and then subsequent various ministries through that, over the course of the next 10 or so years, that relationship that we had, even though now we were 2,000 miles away, continued to grow and just stayed just as strong. But then I found myself back in East Tennessee about 10, 15 years after I'd left. With a decade of ministry experience myself, I found myself broken I found myself feeling like I didn't want to do ministry anymore. Everything that as a 18, 19, 20, 21 year old enthusiastic young minister ready to go out and conquer the world with the cause of Christ, I now found myself as a, you know, in my late 20s, completely broken and wondering what I was supposed to do with my life. I can remember sitting down with you and having conversations how you said you'd seen so many young men and women that you had had the privilege to be an influence in their life, much like you were mine, that you had seen in the same place. And our conversations led us to seeing all these men and women that should have had long, fruitful ministries that were now teaching school or selling insurance or working at a bank. And not that there's anything wrong with that in any kind of way. They were finding joy and purpose in their life. But at one point, they had seen the entire course of their life be directed towards vocational ministry. And because of hurt, because of burnout, or because of brokenness, their life had taken a different trajectory. And I can remember you and I having many, many conversations at Aunt B's on Milligan High, talking about, and this was back before they had made it illegal to smoke in a restaurant, and so we would have to find a little corner in the back of Aunt B's that wasn't filled with cigarette smoke, to where we needed masks long before COVID just to be able to survive in the restaurant. And everything that they brought out had a subtle taste of nicotine in all of their eggs and their toast and their bacon. But you and I had many, many conversations about what is the church doing to the church, capital T, capital C? What is the church at large doing to protect, to love, and to care for their shepherds, for their ministers? And with that, we decided, with the help of my dad, who had had several decades of ministry experience, ministry leadership, and organizational leadership, that we had decided to do something about that. That we were sick of seeing churches closing their doors and men and women who should have had long, exciting ministries burning out or falling out of ministry altogether. And so that kind of brought us to this place in 2005 where we decided to do something about that. And so we started an organization called Higher Ministries, and really kind of launched into something that over the course of the next couple of decades would be a very meaningful part of both of our lives.
Tony, you had such a passion and a fire that I didn't want to see extinguished. And you came and we met several times, and your dad helped out. But we both had the same vision. We a passion for the church, and a passion for those who are leaders in the church, and how can we help them? And over the years, Higher Ministries has done that with several people, and you've been successful in ministry, and leading people and coaching people, and I find joy in sitting down with you, and I find joy in sitting down with other young ministers, and helping them look through that and realize that it's not a journey straight up. If you're thinking about ministry and I'm just going to go straight to heaven, it isn't that. There's always mountains and there with valleys to go, and you just expect that, and you work through that, and pray your way through that. And churches are the same way. Churches have their valleys and they have their peaks, and how do we help them reach more of the peaks and get out of the valleys? I guess is what I really want to do. And as I look at the church, I see when Jesus said that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, it means the church is going to win. It means the church is the biggest, most powerful thing there. We just need to how to learn how to work together in church and have relationships and keep those young men and those young women who are wanting to do leadership, keep them passionate. And so we've provided retreats for them, spiritual retreats for them. We've provided different kind of things to help them through that. And many are still back in ministry who might not be. And if any of you who are listening in are feeling like ready to give up, or give in, hang in there. Contact us. Let us talk with you. Let us help you. The ministry is still a high calling, and even though it gets difficult, it doesn't mean it's not a high calling, and it doesn't mean it's not your calling to do. Difficulty doesn't mean that. Difficulty may mean that you're doing right things, and Satan's trying to make your life miserable, so that you don't continue on. But I've watched times in life, even my own life, I watched a period of my life where I thought, am I supposed to stay in ministry? And I tried something, a step out of ministry, still parachurch, but a step out of ministry, and it just wasn't enough. There was too much I needed to be doing with the call that I was given, that wasn't raising money or doing something else for someone. It was just touching lives. And that's what I think that the leaders of a church know, that they're small or large, you're touching lives.
Yeah, we have, over the course of the last almost 20 years, we've worked with literally hundreds of ministers and Christian leaders. And we've had the privilege to sit down with a lot of young men and women who are just coming out of Bible college or just coming out of seminary and looking for that first or second ministry experience. Look how they're getting their feet wet. They're jumping into the deep end in ministry. And one of the things that I always tell them, that you just kind of touched on, is that if you can do anything else and be happy, do it.
Amen.
If you can find fulfillment and joy in doing something other than vocational ministry, do it, because ministry is difficult. Ministry is overwhelming. It's hard. It's burdensome. It's exhausting. I won't even say tiring. It's exhausting. There's a lot of expectations put on you from day one. So if you can find something else that you can do with your life that is going to make you feel happy and fulfilled, do it. But if you're truly called to ministry, nothing else will make you feel fulfilled.
I echo those words to people all the time. How do you know if you're called to ministry? Can you do something else? And honestly, you should be. If you're called to ministry, you should be able to do a whole bunch of things, because God's given you those gifts. But He's given you a calling, and you're not going to be happy doing the other things. You're not going to be fulfilled doing those things. And the only thing that fulfills you is that passion for the church, and for serving others, and for serving God, and using your gifts in ministry. I think that that's the highest calling a person can receive. And Tony's right. If you can do something else, I would tell you do it, because it's going to be easier.
You make a whole lot more money too.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things we found when we first started Higher Ministries is we were really focused just on working with ministers, being a coaching and counseling agency for ministers. My dad was a professional counselor for 20 years, ran his own counseling agency, and so we had the clinical side covered. You and I were very educated and skilled in the life coaching, ministry coaching sort of things. And so that's where we started. What we then began to quickly see is the issues that ministry leaders were having were more systematic than they were individualized, meaning it was more an issue of their churches. The organization wasn't doing enough or anything to care for them, to provide staff honoring culture around them, to give them the freedom to dream and then permission to lead in that dream. There was a misbalance of expectations on both sides. And so we looked at your history in organizational communication. We looked at my dad's history, having been one of the foremost business consultants around the world for the federal government for decades. And we said, you guys already have the expertise in organizational development. The problem that we're seeing in the church, the root problem of why all these ministers are burning out or just leaving ministry altogether for various reasons, was systematic. It was an organizational problem. So instead of just focusing on helping the wounded minister, the wounded leader, which is something we wanted to continue to do and would always do. Why don't we try to solve the problem at the root? And so we started working using techniques and things that we'd already been doing in corporate America and in government agencies. We tweaked some of that to the church, and that took off. We started working with churches all over the country, various sizes. And that was honestly a joy to hit the road with you and get to visit a lot of different churches, a lot of different people, see many different things that happened. But what we begin to see over time is when we first started in 2005, 2006, we were one of the few organizations doing what we do. You had some big church consulting companies that charged thousands of dollars just to get them on the phone or get them into your place. But for what we were doing for little or no cost, we were one of the few that were there. Over the course of the next decade or so, we saw more and more of these parachurch organizations popping up, more and more of these church consulting and church leadership organizations coming into existence, and because of their resources, because of the backings that they had, gaining a lot of notoriety and credibility, doing some really great ministry. And what we begin to see is the larger churches either had someone on staff that was doing what we do, or they were going to call one of the big international church consulting agencies to come and work with them. Who was really hurting and being forgotten and almost completely left out were smaller churches.
Right.
And we kind of define a small church as anyone that has an average attendance of 150 or less. Average weekend attendance of 150 or less is a small church. Which we've seen statistically makes up about 65-70% of the churches in the United States. And they don't have the resources to hire staff that are going to help them with the organizational issues, help them with the leadership circumstances and issues that they might face, that they don't have the financial capabilities to travel to some of the big church leadership conferences or work with some of the high-end church consulting, leadership consulting firms across the country. And so we begin to shift our focus into working primarily with small churches, small church pastors, small church leaders, and the churches that they serve. And over the last several years, that's really been our focus and has been, honestly, incredibly rewarding.
Well, I think that the small church doesn't have to be limited. It's just if your vision's limited, you will be limited. But you don't have to be limited. Lack of resources doesn't mean lack of vision. So we try to help people get a vision and see that and get a sense of even our own feeling of joy in doing ministry, and it's not a chore. It's a joy for me to do ministry and to work like that and to small churches, and that's what's led to this podcast. We're trying to find ways to get small churches information or help without a lot of cost. And we can do that, I believe, by doing a podcast, listening to you, to respond to us, bringing to you resources that you wouldn't have access to otherwise, and we can pick their brains about what's going on. But the world has become more and more digital. And I had a conversation just a few months ago at a funeral, and I was talking to a couple ministers my age, and I'm not going to tell you what that is, but they were older. And one of them just said, I hated COVID. I hated the whole idea of this Zoom kind of stuff. And we just did it once or twice, and we just quit. And I asked, well, what happened to your congregation? He says, well, they're kind of scattered, and we're trying to get them back. But I just could not function within. And my response was, if you're not comfortable, find a way to get comfortable. But if you're leaving people out there without a resource, then they're going to scatter, and you're going to come back to nothing. or next to nothing, instead of coming back to a church that is still hung together. The church I serve has a number of people online, but we have a large congregation meets face to face. But the online part has stayed there, and one of my questions: how do you minister to a small church if it's online or if it's digital? What do you do to help them do things? It's no different than big church. You've got to find a way to minister to those people who are doing that. And so we're doing the podcast, and this is my first podcast ever, and trying to help you in a digital world who are trying to figure that out. Figure out, how do I do this? Do I keep being digital and face-to-face? We go face-to-face entirely, and we cut out the digital. Those are some of the questions I think churches are still asking right now. They're not having a good answer because COVID's still out there, and there are some people who are terrified of COVID. How do we, in the environment of a smaller church, how do we reach those people and keep them faithful and help them grow?
Yeah.
Even though we may not be able to meet together. And then the other part is the discouragement people get in life. Not just ministers, but people in life altogether need to have a place where they can go and express their needs. You know, I just today, this week, my boss fired me, or my boss warned me, or something, or this has happened to my family. Where do we go? If we go in a world that is faceless, in a world that has no relationships, we're lost. God created the church, and the church is to be a family, and is to minister to one another, and to take a consideration of those needs and help people respond and overcome and become what God wants them to be. I think the church, again, small or large, is the most powerful organization in the world, and it's backed by the best backer ever, God. And He wants it to succeed, and we want to succeed too.
Bruce, we have one of the things that we do with Higher Ministries is we go into churches that have lost their pastor, and we do interim ministry. Mm-hmm. Our interim ministry is a little different than most interim ministries in that we ask them to sign a contract that we not only will do the typical interim ministry things of their preaching on Sunday mornings, Wednesday nights, if they have those, and do the basic hospital visitations, pastoral care type stuff. But we also require them to go through a strategic process with us, to where we really, before we even start the search for a new minister, we really dive into who the church is and where they're going, so that they're hiring someone in their new position that can just seamlessly move in with the trajectory of where the church is going, and not a stagnant, dormant church that says, okay, now we need you to jumpstart us and get us going, and it doesn't line up with the vision or the mission. You and I have had the opportunities over the last several years to work with numerous small churches, numerous church leadership teams, most of which are with churches that we would categorize as small churches. And one of the things that we see a lot of times is that these churches use their lack of resources as an excuse. I was meeting with a small church minister just a few days ago, and I went out to his church to meet with him, and we were just talking through some different resources, some different things that he could use to get some new ideas for things that he could be doing with his church. And so I pulled out my computer and went to log onto a website, to get onto a website to show him some things, and I couldn't get onto a website. There was no internet service, and I said, "Oh, do you guys have internet service out here?" And he just laughed. He said, we don't have internet at our church. You have to go down to the McDonald's in town or a coffee shop or just go home and do that. We don't have internet service out here. And so a lot of times small churches use their lack of resources as an excuse for lack of movement. And I don't even want to say lack of growth, because one of the things that we'll discuss at length in the episodes of this podcast is how your definition of success as a church shouldn't have anything to do with your numerical growth. That there are signs of spiritual growth that you can see if your church only has 15 people, that you can be a healthy, thriving, vibrant church that is having an incredible impact on the kingdom of God if you are a small church. And so lack of numbers of bodies of people and lack of seeing exponential growth in your church does not mean that you're an unhealthy church. What does show that you're an unhealthy church is a lack of vision. And a lack of resources is not an excuse for a lack of vision. Can you speak a little bit to that and what you've seen in some of the small churches that we've worked with?
Well, oftentimes we just we see churches kind of just turn in, and they're just going to hold place. And when they do that, then there's no way it seems like almost when you do ministry with some of the smaller churches we've seen, if they've given up, it's almost like we're doing hospice. We're taking care of the body as it dies, and that's not what the church is about. And so it needs to have, the small church has to have courage and to reach out to what resources they can find. And we are one of those resources, but there are other resources but find some things, or another minister in the area who has some vision, and kind of sit down with him and learn a little bit about what he does, or get other preachers together in your community and share the needs that you have. Not comparing your churches and their growth and all the ladders that you're climbing, but the passion is, hey, I've had this difficulty, and somebody able to step in and say, here, I've had the same problem. And we would like to have that kind of thing happen, but we need to have the vision that we can get out of it. We're not. What's a rut? It's a tomb with both sides knocked out of it. So it's actually a grave, and I'm still in a rut. Well, why are you in a rut? Because I've not worked to get out of it. So if you stay in a rut, it's just being in a grave. And they're just ends are wide open, but you're not getting out. And that's great. That was a metaphor that I think I just messed up. But it's what it is. We give up, and I think Tony and I have seen that in ministers. We've seen that in churches. We've seen that in elders. They will just give up. We can't do any more, or we're just going to get by. And get by isn't what God wants. And get by isn't what's going to really bring kingdom growth. Get by is just that. Pulling in the wagons and circling the wagons and just trying to stay safe from all those who are trying to get you.
Yeah, you are called to more than just getting by.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bruce, as we are coming to the end of our first episode of this podcast, let's take a minute and let's just talk about what our listeners can expect going forward. This will be a weekly podcast. We'll have new episodes that will air every Tuesday morning, and we're going to cover a wide variety of topics, a wide variety of issues that the church is facing. We're hoping to give personal resources and insights for the individual Christian leaders, but also resources, information for the organization as a whole, for you in your church leadership and strategy going forward. We're going to have lots of great guests that will be joining us, focusing on specific issues that they have expertise in, and just very excited to see where this thing goes.
I am too, Tony. When you mentioned this, it terrified me at first because I didn't know if I really would do very well with it, and maybe I will, maybe I won't. But I have such a passion I want to share with people, and I like to see out of this we become more than just a podcast, but a community of people, and we get to know each other back and forth with back and forth communication, and actually do become a real guide and good assistant to you for the church.
Yeah, I hope so too. So, with that, thank you for listening to the first episode of the Small Church Podcast. If you have any questions or comments for Bruce or for myself, you can reach us at www.higherministries.com. That's HIGHER ministries.com. You can find the subsequent episodes of our podcast wherever you would find your favorite podcasts, on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Podcasts, or wherever you like to download of your podcasts. We thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Small Church Podcast, and we look forward to being with you again next week.
Yeah.